Chapters 13 and 14 of When Shadows Die by E.D.E.N. Southworth. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13 The Captain of the Argent. Our travelers arose very early the next morning. The very first news that met Mr. Force on his entrance into the gentlemen's reading room was, that the Argent was in the navy yard. She had arrived at dawn that morning. The squire hastened to the ladies' parlor to communicate the news to Mrs. Force and the girls. There was a general exclamation of joy, and then a sharp cry of anxiety from Rosemary. "Oh, when shall we find out about Roland?" she pleaded. "This very morning, dear child. No more to morrows. To morrow has come," replied Mrs. Force, with a smile. Yet, oh, how wan a smile! "Come down to breakfast at once. We will get a cup of coffee or something, and then start for the navy yard, and go on board the Argent," said the squire, giving his arm to his wife. They went down to the saloon and breakfasted as well as they could for the excitement, which took away their appetite. After that Mr. Force went out to hunt up a carriage, for there was none on the stand. When he returned, he said: "My children, I could only get one hack, and it will hold but 4 persons inside. Your Uncle Enderby does not wish to go out. Therefore, Wynnette and Elva, you will remain here under the protection of your uncle, until we come back. Your mother, your sister, and your little friend will go with me." "But where is Uncle Gideon?" inquired Rosemary. "My child, chains would not have held him here. He has gone down in an omnibus to the navy yard." Preparations were soon made, and Mr. Force and the 3 ladies were on their way to the east end of the city. They drove through the navy yard gate, past the officers' quarters and the workshops, and down to the waterside. There lay the Argent at anchor a few hundred yards from the shore. Mr. Force directed the driver to draw up. Then he alighted from the carriage and handed his wife down. Odalite and Rosemary sprang out unassisted. Odalite's face was bright, eager, expectant. Rosemary's, pale, timid and anxious. Both stood out looking upon the prize. "How shall we reach the ship?" inquired Mrs. Force. "I must signal for a boat to come off and fetch us. Stay, there is a boat coming," announced the squire, and soon they all saw the boat that had been partly hidden in the shadow of the ship's hulk, put off from her side. It was rowed by 6 sailors, and approached the shore rapidly. "Who is in it? Oh, if it should be Roland!" aspirated Rosemary, in a low, deep tone. "Who is it, Abel?" inquired Mrs. Force of her husband, who was looking through a field glass. "There is but one man besides the oarsman, and his back is to us. I do not know who he is, but he is neither Leonidas nor Roland. He is much too stout for either of our boys. He is as broad-backed as old Gideon Grandiere." "By the way, where is Capt. Grandiere? You said he had come down to the yard, but we have not seen him." "My dear, he was a full half hour in advance of us, and must be on board the Argent, giving the officers and crew the benefit of his views on piracy. Come, the boat is almost here." A few minutes after the boat landed, the sailors drew in their oars, and the single passenger turned around, got upon his feet, and stepped ashore. He was the old skipper. "Oh, Capt. Grandiere! What news?" exclaimed Mr. Force, while all his party looked the eager question which they did not put into words. "No news at all. Nothing but a fresh disappointment and a longer suspense." "What do you mean?" inquired Mrs. Force. The old man took off his cap, drew his red bandana from its crown, deliberately wiped his face and head, replaced the handkerchief in his cap, and his cap upon his crown, and answered: "There's nobody aboard that can tell me anything, or that will tell anything if they can." "And did you learn nothing?" "Nothing but this: that Lieut. Force has gone to make his report at headquarters, and nobody knows when he will be back. And the pirate and his mate are gone before the commissioner of prisoners, and nobody knows what their fate is to be." "And did you hear nothing at all of Roland?" inquired Rosemary, in a faint voice. "Nothing whatever, my girl. I did inquire, but no one knew anything of any young man of that name. I am very sorry, my poor child." Rosemary had grown very pale, and looked as if she were about to faint. The old skipper raised her in his arms and laid her in the carriage, where she sank back upon the cushions. Mrs. Force got in, seated herself beside Rosemary, and drew the suffering girl to her bosom. "Have courage, my love," she whispered, through her tears. "Have courage. Roland may have made his escape from the Argent before she was captured by the Eagle, or he may be, by a mistake, with the other prisoners on board a man of war. Have courage, dear love." "Oh, Mrs. Force, I cannot! I cannot any longer! I feel as if I should give up and die!" moaned the girl. Mr. Force handed Odalite into the carriage, and then turning to the old skipper, said: "Capt. Grandiere, if you will get in with the ladies I will take a seat with the driver, and we will all go on together." "I will take the seat by the driver, and thank you, if you will allow me. But I cannot be shut up in the inside of that hack. I would rather walk," replied the old sailor. "As you please," said Mr. Force, and he helped the skipper to mount the box, and then entered the carriage and seated himself with his womenkind. "Where to, sir?" inquired the driver. "To the office of the Commissioner of Prisoners, and on your way call at the hotel where you took us up." "Yes, sir." The carriage drove off, passed through the Navy Yard gate again, and took its way up Garrison Street to Pennsylvania Avenue, and thence to the West End. Half an hour's rapid drive brought the party to the front of their hotel. "My dear," said the squire to his wife, "I cannot take you and these girls to the commissioner's office. I will take you upstairs, and ask your brother if he would like to accompany me." "Very well, Abel," replied the lady. Mr. Force got out, handed down his wife and the young ladies, and escorted them into the hotel. They found the earl and his two nieces in the parlor. The two girls started up with the question: "What news?" "No very definite news," replied their father, "but your mamma will tell you all we have learned. I am going to the office of the Commissioner of Prisoners, to see if I can meet Le. If I can, I will wait until he is at leisure, and bring him here. Enderby, would you like to go with me and see what it is?" "Very much," replied the earl. And the two men went out together. They entered the carriage, which was driven off immediately. It was but a short drive, and in less than 10 minutes the carriage drew up, and the gentlemen alighted. Capt. Grandiere climbed down from his seat, and the three entered the building together. The place had once been a commodious dwelling house, but was now, like many others of the finest mansions in Washington, taken for the service of the government. A sentinel was on guard before the door. Mr. Force spoke a few words to him, and passed on with his party. He entered a front hall, and thence through a door on the right they passed into a large front room, furnished with seats all round its walls, and a long table at its back, with chairs behind it, and folios and stationery on its top. 2 or 3 men, in uniform, sat behind this table, while all around the room, on the benches against the walls, sat a rough looking score of men guarded by soldiers. There was another door on the right of the long table, and opening into a rear room. A sentinel, or janitor, stood at that door. While they waited to be admitted to the presence of the commissioner, the door opened, and 2 prisoners came out, guarded by a detachment of soldiers. "There he is! There is the head devil, and not in irons, either! And there in his company, a prisoner, too, by all that is atrocious, is my mate, Roland!" The 2 gentlemen looked up, stared at the prisoners, who were slowly crossing the room to the outer door, closely guarded by the soldiers, stared until the elder and stouter of the 2 lifted the back of his hand to his forehead in a mock salute, and smiled, while the younger fixed a gaze of yearning entreaty upon the face of his old captain, and then turned the same gaze upon his old friend. Yes, the pirate's first officer, taken red-handed with him, was Roland Bayard. But who was the pirate himself? CHAPTER XIV WHO he was. "You say this man is the captain of the Argente?" inquired Mr. Force of the old skipper, when the prisoners and their guard had passed out of the room. "Yes, he is Silver the pirate captain! No irons on his wrist yet! Prisoner of war, is he? Ah, ah! We shall see! We shall see! But my brave Roland, taken with him! This, then, was the blockade runner's first officer whom they were talking about, who was taken with him, and is now sent to prison with him! Oh, Roland, Roland! Is it possible that you yielded to temptations to join in a lawless life? But it will cost you your own life, Roland, my lad! No rescued prisoner from the pirates' clutch are you, Roland, but a comrade of pirates yourself! I thought I knew the boy! I thought I knew him for an honest lad! But I was mistaken in him! Oh, how mistaken I was!" While the captain was muttering these lamentations to himself, Mr. Force was standing in a maze of perplexity, not thinking then so much of Roland as of the pirate captain. The earl touched him on the shoulder and aroused him. "I know the villain," he said. "I have much cause to know him. His name is Stukely Byrne Stukely. Once a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, but cashiered years ago for dishonorable conduct." Mr. Force stared at the speaker, but did not reply. "Why, Force, you look as if you knew the fellow also. You look as if you could a tale reveal. What is it?" "I know the man. But I know him as Angus Anglesea, Esq., of Anglewood Manor, late colonel in the East India Service." "What, Force! That fellow? He is not Anglesea. He never was in the army in all his life. He was in the navy, and kicked out for disgracing it. Is he the man you have known to your grief as Anglesea?" "He is." "Then, Force, the mystery that puzzled me is solved. The inconsistency that distressed me is reconciled. I never could understand how you could accuse my friend Angus Anglesea, the Christian gentleman and renowned soldier, of the base and cowardly crimes committed by your persecutor. How could I associate theft, forgery and bigamy with such a character as that of Angus Anglesea, though they are very consistent with the career of Byrne Stukely? Who is this man, and how is it that he could take the name and style of an officer and a gentleman, and deceive us all, even my wife, who had known Col. Anglesea in his youth?" demanded the squire. The earl shrugged his shoulders, and then replied: "The fellow is a near relation of Anglesea, and bears a strong personal resemblance to him. In their youth and early manhood they were counterparts of each other, but as they have grown older they have diverged in appearance, so that now no one could mistake the one for the other. The reason is this: both boys inherited the same form, features and expression from the same remote ancestor, but they inherited different dispositions, and have had different trainings. Each has grown old in the likeness of his love, and so they have now grown apart. Angus Anglesea is of medium size, as well as of medium height. His features are clean cut, his complexion clear and pale, his expression grave, sweet, thoughtful, benevolent, intellectual. Stukely is, as you see, overgrown, with an obese form, bloated features, red face, and a brutal, sensual and sometimes ferocious expression." "Yes," replied Abel Force, "and the last 3 years of lawless life has made him even more brutal than ever." "He was in his earlier life a protege of Anglesea's. It was his influence that got him into the Royal Navy. But he is, and has been for years, a sharp thorn in the side of Angus, taking advantage of his personal resemblance to his cousin, using his knowledge of his relative's affairs and his skill in imitating his handwriting, to swindle every one everywhere who came under his notice. This was the adventurer who tried to marry your daughter, Force. It is well the marriage was stopped at the altar, though the California woman, poor soul, had no right to interfere." "Why?" demanded Abel Force. "Because Stukely has a wife and 5 children living near Anglewood, on the charity of Angus Anglesea." "Thank Heaven!" exclaimed Abel Force, earnestly. "There is now nothing to prevent the happiness of my dear Odalite and Leonidas." "I don't know what you are both talking about, I am sure," complained the old skipper. "No, you do not know our family history for the last 6 years, Capt. Grandiere, or the trouble we have suffered through that man of whom we have been speaking; but you shall know all at our earliest convenience." "But Roland! Oh, Roland! What will become of my boy?" groaned the captain. "Can you not prove that he was taken prisoner by the pirate?" demanded Mr. Force. "Yes, but I cannot prove that he did not join the pirates, as Silver told me that he meant to do. And here he is under a false name, Craven Cloud, first officer to the pirate captain. It looks black. I wish I had never lived to see this day!" groaned the captain. After they had waited about half an hour in the hope of seeing Le come out of the commissioner's office, Mr. Force went and spoke to the messenger at the door. "Do you know whether Lieutenant Force, who brought the prize ship with the prisoners this morning, is now with the commissioner?" "No, sir, he is not. He came with the prisoners this morning, and made his report, and left them, and then went up to the Navy Department," replied the man. "Thank you. That will do. Come, Enderby. Come, Grandiere. We may as well return to the hotel. We shall not be likely to find Le. We must wait until he comes to us, I suppose. If he only knew what good news waits him, he would hurry." "If he only knew that we were in the city, or where to find us. But he does not, you see," said the earl. "Wait one moment!" exclaimed the captain. "I must speak to that man before we go. Can you tell me where those 2 prisoners have been sent?" "To the Old Capitol prison," replied the messenger. "Can I get to see them?" "Only by a permit. Go on, Force. You and the earl. I am going to see my dear boy. Oh, Heaven! Who shall tell poor Rosemary?" CHAPTER XV Chapters 15 and 16 of When Shadows Die, by E.D.E.N. Southworth. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Chapter 15. Leonidas. "What do you think of this case of young Bayard?" inquired the earl, as the two gentlemen drove back to the hotel. "I cannot think. I have never in my life felt so amazed, so confused, and so uncertain. The sudden meeting of Anglesea—" "Stukely, my dear friend, Stukely," interrupted the earl. "Stukely, then! The man we have known as Anglesea, and now known as the blockade runner, slaver and pirate, has demoralized my mental faculties!" exclaimed Abel Force. "Do you believe Bayard to be a voluntary confederate of the pirate?" "No, no! If you put the question in that way, I say no. I do not believe it." "The young man was a protege of yours, I have heard." "Yes." "Yet you do not know his parentage, or what traits of character he may have inherited, which may have been kept down by circumstances, and only wanted opportunity to spring into life and activity." "I have known Roland from boyhood. I have watched over him as over a dear son, and I have never seen a low, base or false trait in his character. His words, his deeds and his thoughts, so far as I could read them, have always been pure and true and high. I cannot think of him in any other light than that of my long knowledge of him. I said from his boyhood. I meant from his babyhood." "I hope the young fellow's character may be vindicated. But his case looks very bad just at present." "I hope much from his old captain's interview with him. Roland may be able to explain his position to our satisfaction. I shall wait anxiously for news from the captain. Or Le may be able to throw some light upon this subject. He may be able to tell us why Roland was brought home as a prisoner, instead of as a rescued man. We must wait for more light, Enderby." "Yes. In the meantime, shall you tell the poor little girl the truth of Bayard's position? Is it necessary that she should be told, just at this point, when we know so little, and that little is so perhaps needlessly alarming?" "No, I think not. I will not tell Rosemary that he is a prisoner. I must tell her only that he is alive and well, and that he will come to see us as soon as he can. Here we are at the hotel. And, thank Heaven, we have good news for Odalite. Our darling is free, absolutely free, and may marry her faithful betrothed to morrow, if she pleases," said Abel Force, as he alighted from the carriage, followed by the earl. They went upstairs together and entered the parlor, where they found Mrs. Force and the four young girls anxiously awaiting them. "Did you find Le?" eagerly inquired Mrs. Force. "Oh, did you find Roland?" breathed Rosemary, clasping her hands. Odalite, Wynnette and Elva looked all the interest they did not put into words. "No, my dears, we did not find Le, but we heard of him. He and Roland are both in the city, and both alive and well, and both will come to see us as soon after they shall have found out that we are in Washington as they possibly can," said Mr. Force, throwing himself into a chair. "Where are they now, papa, besides being in the city, which is a place of magnificent distances, you know?" inquired Wynnette. "My dear, Le is everywhere, except here. Le is ubiquitous. He is a will o' the wisp. We have spent the day in following him about. He was on his ship, but when we got there he was gone to the Navy Department, and when we reached there he was off to the office of the Commissioner of Prisoners. When we arrived at the last mentioned place, he was gone back to the Navy Department. So we came here to report and get a little rest and refreshments, and then we are going down to the navy yard to board the Argente, and wait there until we see him. He is sure to turn up on the Argente, well, sooner or later, as he is in command." "And Roland?" softly murmured Rosemary. "Roland, my dear, is alive and well, but he does not know where you are any more than Le does. We must find Le, and let him know that we are here," said Mr. Force. Then, with a total change of manner, he began: "Come here, Odalite, my dear, and sit beside me. I have such good news for you as shall give you patience to wait for Le, if he does not come here for a week; but such news that, if he knew it, would bring him within an hour." Full of vague expectancy, Odalite came and threw herself down on the sofa beside her father, and looked up into his eyes. "My dear Odalite, what would be the very best news that you could hear to day?" he inquired. Odalite gazed into his eyes, too much excited to speak. Fearing, indeed, to speak, lest his next words should disappoint her raised hopes. while Mrs. Force and every occupant of the room, except the earl, waited breathlessly. "Oh, tell me, papa! Tell me what you have to tell!" pleaded Odalite. "Tell me first what would be the best news you could possibly hear to day?" persisted Abel Force. His daughter gazed into his face, while her color went and came and went, but she did not speak. "Well, Odalite?" he inquired. "Father," she answered, gravely, "the best news that I could hear, that any of us could hear to day, would be that the war was ended, the country at peace, and the North and South friends again." "A conscientious reply, my dear. That would certainly be the best news that any of us could hear. But it is not the news that I have to tell, my love. Try again. My news is of a private nature, and concerns yourself." "What would be the best news that you could hear concerning yourself?" persisted the squire. "That I were free." The words came in a tone of impassioned aspiration that spoke volumes of the suffering the girl had endured under the incubus that darkened and oppressed her life. "Then, my dear, hear it!" said the squire, earnestly. "Odalite, you are free!" "Father!" The cry came from her soul, and it was echoed by her sisters and her friend. "Abel!" This was from his wife. "Yes, my dears, it is true," replied the squire. "Odalite is free!" "Anglesea is dead, then? Our terrible enemy is dead?" exclaimed Elfrida Force, with a sigh of infinite relief. "No, my dears, Anglesea is not dead, I thank Heaven! Long may that gallant soldier and true gentleman live to enrich humanity! But your enemy is dead to you, Odalite! You are free, my child! As free as either of your sisters! And you have always been free, my dearest dear, although I did not know it until to day!" "What is the meaning of all this?" demanded Elfrida Force, in a voice of doubt and pain. "Tell your sister, Enderby! Tell them all, and all about it! I cannot! I am not equal to the task! I should talk like a fool!" said the squire, drawing his handkerchief from his pocket and wiping his brows. Thus adjured, the earl looked around on the group of eager listeners, and said, addressing Mrs. Force: "You may remember, Elfrida, how amazed and incredulous I was when you told me of the disgraceful career of one whom you called by the name of my nearest and dearest friend, Angus Anglesea." "Yes, yes!" eagerly exclaimed the lady. "And with good reason was I thus amazed and incredulous. To think a gentleman of purest honor in one hemisphere should become an unmitigated scoundrel in another was simply impossible. I did not and could not comprehend the enigma, and I did not try." "But sometimes you nearly lost your temper with us," put in Mrs. Force. "I did, because I thought you ought to have known my brother officer better than to have believed him guilty of all the crimes of which he was accused. Elfrida, I had forgotten one matter that might have cleared up the mystery at once, and that matter was the existence of Byrne Stukely." "Byrne Stukely? Who was he?" inquired Mrs. Force. "He was the man who, under the name of Angus Anglesea, tried to marry your daughter, but failed so signally that he has not even the shadow of a shade of claim upon Odalite. She will need not the slightest action of the law to free her from that incomplete ceremony begun in All Faith Church. No, my dear, Odalite Force, as my brother in law has just said, is as free as either of her sisters. Byrne Stukely has a wife and half a dozen children, more or less, living in the town of Angleton, and supported by the charity of Angus Anglesea." "But who, then, in the name of Old Scratch, is this Byrne Stukely?" demanded the irrepressible Wynnette. "My dear, wait until I tell your mamma. Byrne Stukely is a distant, very distant, relation of Angus Anglesea, and yet the two distant cousins were, up to the age of 20 or thereabout, as much alike as twin brothers. They must each have inherited the form, features and complexion of some common ancestor. But there all the resemblance between the men ended, for one inherited all the virtues of his progenitors, and the other all the vices. They were as opposite in character as they were alike in form. This resemblance lasted, as I said, lasted in its completeness until the young men grew to be about 20 years of age, when the character of each began to impress itself upon his face, manner and expression. Anglesea developed into a man of the highest and purest moral and intellectual excellence, and became a Christian gentleman and soldier. Stukely sank down to the level of the beasts, and below them, and became a bloated, brutalized criminal and sensualist. No one, who has known both for the last 20 years, could possibly mistake one for the other. Each has grown into the likeness of his spirit, and therefore they have grown far apart." "I ought to have known he was an impostor," put in Wynnette. "I don't mind other people being deceived in the fellow; but for me not to know, the minute I saw the portrait of the real Col. Anglesea, that the other fellow was a fraud." There were many other people deceived in times past by the exact resemblance between the two men. It was a source of continual embarrassment to the Angleseas of Anglewood. The father of Angus Anglesea procured for young Stukely a midshipman's warrant, and got him sent off to one of our most remote naval stations, to get him out of the way and get rid of him. He went on pretty well for a while, and he received much indulgence, too, for the sake of the benefactor behind him. But rectitude was not the forte of Byrne Stukely, and in the end he disgraced his patron and was dismissed the service." "But how came he in the army?" inquired Wynnette. "He was never in the army. He was no more a colonel than he was an Anglesea, nor more a soldier than he was a gentleman. He was in the navy, as I said, and was kicked out of it. Lastly, he has turned up in the slave trade and the general piracy line of business as Capt. Silver." "Capt. Silver!" echoed every voice, except that of Abel Force. "Yes, my darlings, Capt. Silver of the Argente, ostensibly blockade runner only, subject only to the laws of war, to be held only as a prisoner of war, but really a slaver and a pirate, likely to be tried for his life and hanged for his crimes by this government, or, if he should chance to escape conviction and execution here, where the punishment of crime is so very uncertain, still sure to be claimed by the British government, under the Extradition Act, and hanged by us, who, you know, will stand no nonsense from slavers and pirates. But now, my darlings, let us leave the subject of the villain, and turn to something pleasanter. Odalite, my dear, I congratulate you on your escape, and I hope, when we go down to the Argente this afternoon, we shall be able to bring Lieutenant Force back with us." "Heaven grant it!" breathed Odalite, in a low and fervent voice. "Where is Capt. Grandiere?" inquired Mrs. Force. "He has gone to look up his mate, young Bayard," replied Mr. Force. "Oh, I hope he will bring Roland back with him," sighed Rosemary, who was the frankest little creature in the world. "I hope he may," said Mr. Force. "Come, let us go down to dinner," suggested the earl. CHAPTER XVI THE OLD SKIPPER'S DESPAIR Meanwhile, Capt. Grandiere, having obtained his pass, got into a crowded street car, en route for the Old Capitol prison. After toiling up the long hill on the north side of the Capitol grounds, the car turned into the East Capitol Street. There the old skipper got off, and inquired his way to the Old Capitol, a large pile of brick buildings, looking not unlike a warehouse, but which in its time, before the present beautiful edifice had been raised, was used for the councils of the National Congress, and now was turned into a military prison. Capt. Grandiere found the place, though it looked very much like a Baltimore tobacco depot, and then went up to the main floor, at which a sentry stood on guard. He showed his pass. The sentinel scrutinized it, returned it to him, and let him in. He entered a broad passage, with doors on either side, and a staircase in the midst. These doors were all closed, and a sentry stood at every one. "I wish to see young Mr. Craven Cloud," said the captain, correcting himself, "one of the officers taken prisoner on the blockade runner Argente." The sentry to whom he addressed these words looked at his pass, and said, laconically: "Upstairs." The old man climbed the stairs, and found himself in an upper passage, with other doors on each side, and another staircase in the midst. These doors were also closed, and guarded by sentries. "I want to see Mr. Craven Cloud, one of the prisoners from the blockade runner Argente," said the skipper, handing his pass to the nearest sentry, who looked at it, and answered, shortly: "Upstairs." The old man groaned, and slowly mounted the second flight of stairs, to find himself in a passage exactly like the one below in all respect of doors, sentries and a third staircase. The captain, panting from his long ascent, repeated his formula, and handed his pass, which was returned to him, with the answering formula. The old man, feeling fatigued and dizzy, began to ascend the third flight of stairs. When he reached the top he found himself in a passage precisely like those below, closed doors, armed sentries, and a fourth staircase, probably leading into the garret. "I have been a sailor for 60 years, and hope to sail the seas for 60 more. Men have lived hale and hearty to extreme old age, and why not I, who never was drunk or ill in my life? But if I have to go up another flight of stairs, I shall be cut off in my prime," said the captain to himself, as he leaned, puffing and blowing, against the freshly whitewashed wall. "I feel just like the 'youth who bore through snow and ice A banner with a strange device, Excelsior,' which must mean upstairs. And like him I shall drop dead at the top. Say, you, sir! I want to see Mr. Craven Cloud, who was taken prisoner from the blockade runner Argente. Here's my permit," said the old skipper, as soon as he could get his breath, handing his pass to one of the sentries. "Room at the end, No. 53," said the soldier, returning the paper. "Thank Heaven! That is a change for the better!" exclaimed the old man, trotting up the whole length of the passage to a board partition that seemed to have been temporarily put up across the end. A sentry stood before the door in this partition, and to him the skipper gave his pass. The sentry unlocked the door and admitted the visitor into the small room that had been partitioned off from the front end of the passage. The place was clean, fresh and light, but had no furniture except one narrow iron bedstead with a mattress, a pillow and a white spread as clean as the room. Extended on the mattress lay the young and handsome form of Roland Bayard, clothed only in his white shirt and gray trousers. His hands were clasped above his head, and his eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling. He started up on hearing the visitor enter. "Roland! Roland! My dear boy, Roland!" cried the old skipper, in a tremulous voice, while the tears started to his eyes. If the two had been French or German, they would have fallen into each other's arms. Being Americans of English descent, they only clasped hands a little more firmly than usual, gazed into each other's eyes earnestly for a moment, and then sat down on the side of the bed together in silence. The old skipper at length spoke. "Roland, my dear, dear boy, how is this?" "How is what?" inquired the young man, slowly, and after a pause, speaking in a tone of pain in his hesitating voice, and with a look of pain in his haggard eyes that could not be concealed. "Oh, you know! Dear lad, you know! You know what I mean! How is that I find you here as a prisoner, instead of a free man? Why did you not tell Le that you were a captive among the pirates, not a confederate of them? Le could have corroborated your story, and you would have been brought home in honor, not in this way." "Le could have done nothing for me, under the circumstances," replied the young man, in a tone so full of despair that the old skipper looked at him in horror. "Circumstances, Roland? What circumstances? That devil, Silver, told me he had persuaded you to join his band, but he never told the truth. Surely, surely, Roland, he never told the truth! You never joined the pirate crew! Why do I ask? Of course you never did, and never could," said the captain, speaking with great assurance, but looking anxiously into the face of his favorite for confirmation of his words. No such confirmation came. Roland put up his hand and covered his eyes. He could not bear to meet that anxious, eager gaze of his old friend. "Roland, my dear lad, to what circumstances do you allude? Roland, for my sake, for all our sakes, for little Rosemary's sake, explain yourself." The young man kept his eyes covered and his head bowed, while his whole frame shook as with an ague fit. The old skipper saw the effect of his words, and repeated them: "For little Rosemary's sake, dear lad." "Don't!" wailed Roland. "Don't! I loved the child. Heaven knows how I loved her. She was always the dearest creature on earth to me. I loved her so much that I hope, in these 3 years of absence, in which she has grown from childhood to womanhood, I hope she has forgotten me." These last words were uttered in a wail of anguish. "But she has not forgotten you, Roland. You are the larger part of her life. From the time I met her on the Asia. Did I tell you that I came over on the same ship with Force and his party?" "No. Capt. Silver told me that he had set you ashore on the coast of England, not far from Penzance, and so I supposed that you had come home, but I did not know on what ship or in what company. Go on. You were talking about Rosemary." "We met by chance on board the Asia. Of course there was great surprise on both sides. And of course I told them all about the capture of the Kitty by the pirates. And the first question my niece asked was about you. And from this she has been in a state of continual anxiety about you, anxiety that has been much increased since she learned of the capture of the Argente by the Eagle." "You told her I was with the pirates?" "As a captive, yes! As a well treated captive. I was not likely to repeat to her a tale that I did not myself believe, about your having joined the crew," said the captain, indignantly. Roland again covered his face with his hands and bowed his head. "Boy, what am I to think of your silence?" demanded the old skipper, more in sorrow than in anger. "Oh, my dear old captain, you will think as well of me as you can." "Are you Capt. Silver's mate? Yes or no?" "I cannot tell you." "Roland, if you were the pirate's mate, you would be brave enough to avow it. If you were not, you would be sure to deny it. I do not understand your silence." The young man did not attempt to explain, but sat with his elbows on his knees and his head bowed upon his hands, in an attitude of despair. "I will ask you one other question. Perhaps you will answer it. Do you recognize in the pirate, Silver, the man whom you once knew as Angus Anglesea?" "Yes, I recognized him," replied Roland, wearily. "And he recognized you as the youth he was accustomed to see with the Forces?" "Yes, he knew me at once." "It must have been a strange meeting between you." "It was." "Tell me all about it, Roland, my lad. What did you say to him? What did he say to you when you first met? How did he account for having two characters and two names, eh? Tell me all about it, lad." "I cannot. Believe me, I cannot. Oh, my old captain! My dear old captain! It wrings my heart to refuse you. I would do anything to please you, but I cannot do this which you ask." "I don't understand! I don't understand! I don't believe I shall ever understand!" exclaimed the perplexed captain, shaking his gray head. "Perhaps you never will in this world, but I hope that you will in the world to come, when the secrets of all hearts shall be revealed. In the meantime oh, judge me as charitably as you can!" pleaded Roland. "Heaven knows that I wish to do so, my dear lad. Perhaps you may answer me one more question, a last one. Why did you drop your lawful name of Roland Bayard, and take another by which you are now known, Craven Cloud? You need not answer if you do not choose." "I will tell you. The life of a blockade runner—" "Blockade runner be blowed!" angrily exclaimed the old skipper. "Pirate, you mean. You can't blind me with 'blockade runner,' not after her taking the Kitty. You can't. Pirate, lad, pirate." "Just as you please. The life, I say, on such a ship is uncertain, death often tragic. I did not wish to carry an honest name through such a life, or to such a death. In a word, if those who loved me were destined to hear one Craven Cloud, blockade runner, pirate, slaver, as you please, had been taken and hanged, I did not wish them to know that I was the man. I took an alias, and made it Craven Cloud because the name suited the case. There, that is all." "But, Roland, you are no pirate, no slaver. It is impossible that you should be!" exclaimed the old skipper, with the utmost confidence, yet still eagerly, prayerfully gazing into the troubled face of his young mate for confirmation of those words. But still no such confirmation came. The door opened, and a soldier entered. "Sorry," he said, in a serio comic spirit, in which some of the soldiers jested their cares away, "sorry to separate you, but the best of friends must part. Shutting up time has come, and the word is march." "Do you mean I must go?" inquired the old skipper. "That's about the measure of it, granddad." "Good by, Roland, lad. Mind, I don't believe any ill of you, in spite of all. I shall come to see you again to morrow, and bring Rosemary with me." "No, no! No, no! Do not bring her! I am parted from Rosemary forever. The sight of her would unman me!" cried the youth. "Then what am I to say to her when I see her?" "Say the best you can, the fairest, the most merciful you can!" exclaimed Roland. The old skipper wrung the youth's hand, and left the room. He returned to the hotel, but kept entirely out of the way of the Forces. He had not the courage to meet Rosemary. CHAPTER XVII and 18 of When Shadows Die, by E.D.E.N. Southworth. This recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER XVII On Board the Prize. Soon after dinner the earl and the squire left the hotel for the ship. They took a street car that ran from Georgetown to the Navy Yard gate. There they alighted and entered the yard, passed the officers' quarters, passed the workshops and the ship house, and went down to the waterside. As they neared it they saw an officer in naval uniform standing with his back toward them, and his gaze directed toward a boat, rowed by 6 men, that was swiftly coming toward the shore. Mr. Force quickened his steps, and laid his hand on the arm of the man, whom he had recognized as Le. The latter, turning quickly, started joyfully, and held out both hands, exclaiming: "Uncle Abel!" "Le, dear boy!" cried the squire, seizing the youth's hands and shaking them cordially. "You here! What a surprise! How glad I am to see you! I thought you were in Europe. When did you return? How are my aunt and cousins? And how is Odalite? And " "Softly, Le! Softly, dear lad! One thing at a time. We have just arrived from Europe, and we are all well. And here is a friend of yours whom you are forgetting," said the squire, taking the young man's arm and leading him back to where the earl stood. "Lord Enderby! How glad I am to see you! This is another joyful surprise. You are looking so well, too. Quite recovered your health, I hope," said Le, cordially shaking the hand the earl had given him. "Quite recovered, thank you," replied the latter. "Where are you stopping, Uncle Abel?" "We are stopping at the old place where we boarded 6 years ago, when we first came to Washington. And we have been following you about for the last 24 hours," replied Mr. Force. "And to think I have passed that hotel at least a dozen times within a day without knowing that you were there! What a surprise! And you say Odalite is quite well?" "Odalite and all are quite well." "I am so glad to hear that! And to know that they are all so near. When can I see them?" "As soon as you please. It will depend on yourself. They have been waiting for 24 hours most anxiously to see you." "What a surprise! I cannot get over the surprise! There is the boat, Uncle Abel. Will you and Lord Enderby return with me on board the ship, and spend a few hours with me in the cabin, where we can talk?" Le inquired, as the boat touched the wharf and the rowers laid on their oars. "We came down here for that very purpose," replied the squire. "Come, then." The three gentlemen walked down to the water's edge and entered the boat. The sailors pushed off, turned and headed for the Argente. It was a pretty view. The sun had just set, and the western sky was aflame with the crimson afterglow, which was reflected in the water. The full moon was rising, like a vast globe of gold, above the gray eastern horizon. In the distance before them was the green and wooded shore of Maryland. Midway of the river lay the Argente at anchor, reflected clearly and duplicated distinctly in the water below. They soon reached the ship and stood upon the deck. A young midshipman saluted his superior officer. Le introduced him as Midshipman Franklin, exchanged a few words with him, and then took his friends down into his own cabin. This was quite a luxurious furnished place for the cabin of a man of war, as the pirate ship seemed in a small way to be. An Axminster carpet was on the floor, and blue satin damask curtains before the berths, blue satin damask coverings on the chairs and sofas. A marble-topped round table stood in the center. A marble-topped sideboard, with silver stands for decanters and glasses, stood at the end, opposite the companionway. Le drew chairs around the table and invited his friends to be seated. Then he went to the sideboard and brought forth a bottle of old port wine, with wine glasses, and a box of choice Havana cigars, with wax tapers, and putting them on the table, exclaimed, for the fourth time: "What a surprise! I shall never get over the surprise!" "You talk of surprises, Le," said Mr. Force, when they had all had a glass of wine around, and had lighted their cigars. "You talk of surprises, but you ought to have grown hardened to them by this time. No one could ever have had a greater one than you had when you found in the pirate captain and his mate your old enemy, Angus Anglesea, and your old friend, Roland Bayard." "You may well say that, uncle. But I do believe it was the sight of my old foe that put the devil in me that day, and made me utterly reckless of my life in that fight." "We have all read of your heroism in action, Le, my dear boy, and we are proud of you," said the squire. "It wasn't heroism, uncle. It was diaboloism. If ever the devil got into mortal man, he did into me that day. And it was all at the sight of Anglesea." "No matter. The papers are full of the brilliant action, and you are the hero of the hour." "Of the hour. You are right, uncle. Of the hour. In these days of heroes — on both sides, mind, uncle — no one man, whatever his deeds, could expect to hold public attention for a longer time. But, indeed — and there is no mock modesty in what I say — I have no merit. I was more mad than brave in that action." "Your captain, in his dispatches to the department, puts the case in a better light. But let that pass for the present. Do you know who the pirate really is?" demanded the squire. "No more than that he is Capt. Silver, known to us as Col. Anglesea," said Le. "He is neither entitled to the one name nor the other." "Neither Silver nor Anglesea? Who is he, then?" demanded the young commander, in surprise. Enderby, dear fellow, you, who can speak with authority, tell Leonidas who the man really is." The earl, thus entreated, turned to the young officer and told him the story of Byrne Stukely, as it is already known to our readers. Le listened with the closest attention, and at the close of the narrative drew a deep sigh of relief and breathed forth a fervent thanksgiving. "And so you see by what Enderby has told you that the rascal has not now, nor ever has had, the slightest claim on the hand of Odalite, who is now, and always has been, perfectly free. There is not even any need to seek the aid of the law in her case," said Mr. Force. "Thank Heaven! Oh, thank Heaven!" again fervently exclaimed Le. Then, after a pause, he asked: "Uncle, when can I see Odalite?" "As soon as you please, my boy." "I wish I could see her to night. But to night duty holds me here. Franklin, my second in command, has gone on shore for the first time to see his family, who reside here, and whom he has not seen for 3 years. So I cannot get off to night. But early to morrow. How early may I see her to morrow?" "Come and breakfast with us at 9 to morrow. That is about as early as we can manage." "I will go." "And now, Le, tell us about Roland Bayard. How comes it that he is in the uniform of the pirate's mate? How comes it that he is brought here as a prisoner, instead of as a rescued captive?" The countenance of the young man fell, all the joyous life died out of it, and he murmured: "I had forgotten. In my own selfish joy I had forgotten." "Forgotten? What, Le?" "I had forgotten Roland's position. Oh, Uncle Abel, it is a most cruel one." "Tell me one thing," sternly demanded Mr. Force. "Was he Silver's mate?" "I do not know." "You do not know, Le? What do you mean by that? Surely you must know." "Indeed, I do not, uncle. After the fight was over, and when the 2 prisoners were placed under my charge on board this ship, and she was manned by a part of the crew from the Eagle, and I was ordered to take her home, when we had set sail and were well on our way I went to see Roland to ask him some explanation of his presence on board the blockade runner. He was not known there as Roland Bayard, but as Craven Cloud. I found him alone, for the 2 prisoners had been confined separately. I found him moody to the verge of melancholy madness. I told him how grieved I was to find him there, and asked him to tell me how it happened, when he had left Capt. Grandiere, whether he had joined the navy and had been captured in some action." "And what did he reply to all these questions?" inquired Mr. Force, seeing that Le paused in his narrative. "Not one satisfactory word. He told me that fate had brought him there, and that he could tell me no more. And though I plied him with questions, and appealed to him to answer them, in the name of our lifelong love for one another, he remained obdurate. He assured me that he could not satisfy me." "And he never did?" "He never did. But one day he told me the reason why his tongue was tied." "And what was that?" "It was a terrible revelation, uncle, a terrible revelation. But it accounted for everything that was strange in Roland's life and conduct," replied Le, still shrinking from the utterance of what he had to say. "Well, well, my boy?" demanded the squire. "He told me that Capt. Silver was his own father." "Good Heaven!" exclaimed the earl. The squire was silent for a moment, and then said, in the most emphatic manner: "I don't believe it. It is not true." "Oh, sir, it was true, too true. He had every proof of its truth. Therefore, you understand that poor Roland, if he was a prisoner among the blockade runners and a witness to deeds even more unlawful and more criminal, could not open his mouth with explanations that might be fatal to Capt. Silver. The scoundrel is no more Roland's father than I am. No, not by an infinite distance, for I have been a father to the boy ever since he was a baby, and I know that scoundrel is nothing to him. I know the reason why he told such a falsehood to the young man. It was to get him into his power and seal his lips. Did Roland, for instance, tell you how he came to be separated from Capt. Grandiere and to be on board the blockade runner, or rather the pirate, as she really was?" "No, sir. I explained to you that he would tell me nothing but that fate had brought him there." "Of course. Then I will tell you. Capt. Grandiere's ship, the Kitty, was taken by the pirate Argente about 6 weeks since only. Her crew were put into open boats and sent adrift to sink or swim, find land or perish, as fate might will. Her 2 officers, Skipper Grandiere and Mate Bayard, were taken prisoner and brought on board the Argente, while a part of the pirate crew were sent on board the Kitty to take her, with her rich cargo, to some port, Heaven knows where. That is how young Bayard came on board the pirate ship." "Is it possible?" exclaimed Le, in amazement. "Yes, and from the time the master and mate of the Kitty were captured by Silver they were never allowed to meet. Roland, who had been wounded, was kept below in the cockpit. Silver told Capt. Grandiere that Bayard had decided to take service with him, and did not wish to see his old captain for fear of unpleasant words. Silver was near the English coast, and he sent a boat ashore at night, and landed the old skipper on a remote beach in Cornwall, and left him to find his way to London as best he might." "But how did you find out all this, Uncle Abel?" inquired Le, unable to get over his amazement. "Grandiere went up to London on a third class train, found his correspondence, told his story, got what money he wanted, and engaged passage on the Asia, from Liverpool to New York. We came over on the same steamer. That is how we came to know it." "Where is Capt. Grandiere now?" inquired Le. "In Washington, staying at the same hotel with us. You may judge our surprise, and his triumph, when, on reaching New York 3 days since, we learned that the blockade runner Argente had been captured by the United States man of war Eagle, and had been sent home as a prize, under the command of Lieut. Force. We came down to Washington by the first train, I and my party, to see you and Roland, but Capt. Grandiere avowedly to prove Silver to be a pirate, and to hang him. Capt. Grandiere will now also be able to prove that young Roland Bayard was captured by the pirates at the same time that his ship, the Kitty, was taken, and he, the skipper, taken prisoner. Capt. Grandiere's evidence must vindicate Roland Bayard." "Oh, if it only could! But, uncle, if Roland will not deny that he was a volunteer member of the pirate crew?" "He will deny it, when he knows the pirate lied to him and deceived him, and has no claim whatever to his forbearance, much less to his duty or affection," said Mr. Force. It was growing late, and Mr. Force arose to go. "Uncle," said Le, "why cannot you and the earl stay on board with me to night? I can send a man with a note to the hotel to let the ladies know where you are, and I can make you up most comfortable berths in this cabin, and to morrow we can all three go and breakfast with our friends," pleaded the young man. "Le, my lad, I should like it extremely, but I cannot speak for Enderby," replied the squire. "I propose this," said the earl, "that I return to the hotel to take care of the ladies, and prepare them for your reception in the morning, leaving you here, Force, with your nephew." The earl's proposal was accepted by acclamation, and soon after he took his leave and was rowed ashore, leaving the uncle and nephew to spend the night together on the ship. CHAPTER XVIII A Terrible Revelation "We must wait until Franklin comes on board," said Leonidas Force, the next morning, as he stood beside Mr. Force on the deck of the Argente, looking off toward the navy yard, where a boat had already been sent to bring out the young midshipman. "Will he be punctual?" inquired Mr. Force, who was almost as impatient as his companion to be off to keep their appointment to breakfast with the ladies of the family at the hotel that morning. "Punctual!" echoed Le. "His orders are to report on board at 7 this morning, and he will be here on time." Mr. Force took out his watch and looked at it. "It wants 12 minutes to 7 now!" he exclaimed. "And here comes Franklin!" replied Le, as the young midshipman was seen running across the yard down to the water's edge, where the boat waited. As he jumped on board, the boat was seen to turn and head for the ship. In a few minutes it had crossed the water and come up alongside. Young Franklin sprang out and climbed up on deck. "2 minutes to 7. You are prompt, midshipman," said Le, smiling. "I would rather be an hour too soon than a second too late, lieutenant," replied the young officer, saluting. "Quite right. Tell the coxswain to wait. He is to take this gentleman and myself ashore," said Le. Then he went down into his cabin, followed by Mr. Force, to make a few final preparations. Soon they returned to the deck, went down into the boat and headed for the shore. When they landed, and were walking across the yard, Le asked: "I may at last marry Odalite, without let or hindrance?" "I have told you so, lad." "Yes, bless you, uncle! But how soon? How soon?" "This very day, if Odalite and her mother agree." "Let us walk faster, uncle, please!" pleaded the impatient lover. "My dear Le, consider my rheumatism. Besides, look! There is no car near the gate, and we shall pass through before one comes up." Le saw at once that fast walking would not bring him any sooner to the side of his sweetheart, and so he moderated his haste. They reached the gate just as a car came up, and they entered it while the horses were being unharnessed and turned around. "If one had but wings!" said Le. "You would find them inconvenient on most occasions," replied Mr. Force. Several other passengers now entered the car, and it started on its uptown trip. Passengers from the sidewalks, however, continued to stop the car and crowd in until it was more than full, for every seat was occupied and all the standing room between the rows, as well as both platforms before and behind. This was always the condition of the street cars in war times, when authorities were as careless of the lives of horses as they were of those of men. All private conversation was rendered impossible, and Mr. Force rode on in perfect silence, half suffocated by the close air and heavily pressed upon by a crowd of men standing up in the middle, hanging on by the straps, and swaying to and fro against the forms of their fellow passengers. At last, long last, the ordeal was over. The toiling horses reached the corner of the street on which their hotel was situated, and Mr. Force pulled the strap to stop the car, and with his companion slowly pushed, elbowed and worked his way out of the black hole into the open air. There is one comfort in this difficulty in getting out. Though our clothes are often torn and our flesh scratched or bruised in the trial, yet it gives the wretched horses a minute's rest," said the squire, as, followed by Le, he made his way across the pavement to the ladies' entrance of the house. Here a great shock met him. The earl, pale and grave, stood in the hall waiting for him. He bowed to Le, and then took the arm of his brother in law, and said: "Come with me, Force. Lieutenant, you will find the young ladies in the parlor." Le, surprised and vaguely uneasy, hesitated for a moment, and then ran upstairs. "What is the meaning of this, Enderby? What has happened?" anxiously inquired the squire. "Your wife is not well. She is ill! She is dangerously ill! Let me go to her! Let me go to her at once!" exclaimed the terrified husband, breaking from the earl's hold. "No, no, I beg of you! It would be useless. She is sleeping. 2 physicians and a nurse watch beside her, and they forbid all approach for the present. Come in here with me," said the earl, drawing his brother in law into the nearest room, which happened to be a temporarily untenanted private parlor. "When did this happen? Why was I not sent for at once? What is the nature of her illness? Oh, my dear wife!" exclaimed the squire, as he fell rather than sat down upon the nearest chair. The earl closed the door and turned the key, and then answered: "Not an hour ago, Elfrida and her daughter, with Miss Hedge and myself, were in the drawing room waiting for your arrival, before ordering breakfast. A servant brought in the morning paper, and Wynnette took it to read aloud for the benefit of the party. She turned first to the report of the examination of the 2 prisoners, Silver and Cloud, alias Stukely and Bayard, and of the demand of the British government for their extradition upon charge of piracy and slave dealing. Good Heaven! The demand was said to have come through the British consul at New York, who had been on the watch for the possible capture by our ships of this same pirate ship. Then old Grandiere's word will come true." "Probably. But as Wynnette read I happened to look at my sister. She had grown deadly pale. I arose to go to her, but she raised her hand with a gesture of command that stopped me, and she listened to the end of the reading, and then, with her wonderful self control, deadly pale as she was, arose to leave the room. Wynnette had not observed the change in her mother, but Odalite and Elva had done so, and both of them sprang to her side. Her attack was so sudden and unaccountable." "I understand. I understand," muttered Mr. Force to himself. "But she waved the girls back in the most peremptory manner, and went alone to her room. The children came back to me and gazed in my face for an explanation. I could give them none. They once more started to follow their mother, but I called them back and told them to be patient. Then the condition of little Rosemary Hedge claimed attention. She was sobbing violently on the sofa. I told my nieces to respect their mother's wish to be left alone; that she was probably overcome by the ill news of one whom she had known from his boyhood, and that she would best recover her composure in solitude." "I understand. I understand," again murmured the poor squire to himself. "I went to Rosemary and sought to soothe her. While I was so engaged, little Elva slipped away and went up to her mother's room, and instantly came shrieking back, telling us, in wild and incoherent exclamations, that her mother lay unconscious on the floor of her chamber. Gracious, gracious heavens!" groaned the squire. "We hurried to her assistance, all of us, even Rosemary, who forgot her own grief at this crisis. We found her on the carpet in a deep swoon. She lay face downward, and dressed as if for a journey. By her side lay a traveling bag, which seemed to have dropped from her hand as she fell. "I understand. Oh, I understand too well," muttered the squire to himself. "We got her on the bed and sent for a doctor. There was one in the house, who heard of the event and came first. Then the doctor whom we had sent for arrived. They are with her now. One of them procured a professional nurse. And they are all three agreed upon one point, that no one but the doctor or nurse be allowed to enter the room." "But I must go to her door. I will not make the least noise, but I must go to the door and see one of the physicians," said Mr. Force, rising. "I will go with you," said the earl. The two gentlemen left the room together, and went up 2 flights of stairs to the floor on which was a suit of rooms occupied by the Forces. They paused before the door of the chamber of illness, or it might be of death, and Mr. Force tapped very gently. It was the nurse, a wholesome looking, middle aged woman, who answered the summons. "I wish to see one of the physicians," whispered Abel Force, in a voice that trembled with emotion. The woman stepped noiselessly back into the room, and was presently succeeded by Dr. Bolton, a large, fair, bald headed man, of about 60 years of age. He stepped out into the passage noiselessly, closing the door behind him. Then, in a whisper, he greeted Mr. Force, with whom he had been acquainted. "How is my wife?" he inquired, in breathless anxiety. CHAPTER XIX. Chapters 19 and 20 of When Shadows Die. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Chapter 19. The Bitterness of Death. The doctor took the squire's arm and led him away from the door before he answered. "She is doing as well as possible under the circumstances. All depends now on absolute quiet. It was for that reason I summoned a trained nurse and forbid any of the family to approach her." "But what is the nature of her illness, doctor?" "She has received a severe mental shock." "Of what nature?" "I do not know." "Will she recover?" "With great care, I hope so." "Can I go in, very quietly, and look upon her?" "Not if you speak to her. Not if you waken her." "I will neither speak to her nor waken her. You shall see how noiseless I can be." "I am not going back to her room. I have all my patients to see yet. But I will call again in the afternoon. Dr. Hollis will remain a little longer, and the nurse, Mrs. Winder, can be relied on." "If you enter the room, Mr. Force, let me entreat you to make no sound," said Dr. Bolton, bowing, and passing the squire on his way downstairs. Mr. Force softly turned the handle of the lock, which had been oiled, and entered the room. On the bed, covered with a white counterpane up to her chin, lay the form of his fair wife, still and white as death. On one side of her sat the nurse. On the other side stood the doctor. Mr. Force raised his finger in token that he did not mean to speak, nor expect to be spoken to, and so he approached the bed on tiptoe, and gazed upon the marble features, colorless except for the dark rings around the eyes and lips. As the husband gazed, a spasm of anguish convulsed his features. He turned his eyes from the face of his wife to that of the young doctor, who stood over her. Dr. Hollis smiled and placed his finger on his lips. Abel Force understood both signs, and felt a little hope steal into his heart. He stood for some time longer gazing upon the beloved face, and then, at another sign of the doctor, he turned to steal noiselessly from the room. As he went from the bedside toward the door, his eyes fell on a large packet of paper, with a note tied on the top of it. And as he passed he took it up, thinking that it might be something that required to be sent to the post office. After leaving the room and closing the door softly behind him, he looked at the superscription of the packet, and it was this: "To my dear husband, Abel Force, to be opened by him alone." The packet was sealed and tied with a cord, under which was slipped a letter, directed simply to Abel Force, Esquire. When Mr. Force had looked at this packet, he showed neither surprise at its existence or impatience to read it. Without breaking the seal, he slipped it into his pocket, and went quietly down to the parlor in search of his troubled young people. He found them all seated as if they had been at a funeral. Odalite and Le occupied one of the small sofas. Old Capt. Grandiere sat in a large armchair, with his little niece, Rosemary, on his knees, her head on his shoulder and her arms around his neck. She had sobbed herself into exhaustion, and therefore into quietness, and was listening calmly to the consolation the old skipper was trying to give her, and which was something like this: "I tell you, my pet, he may be as stubborn as a mule, and hold his tongue until he loses the use of it, but I know that, not 2 months since, he was taken prisoner off my ship, along with me and all the crew, and so far from being the pirate's mate, he was the pirate's prisoner. I'll tell my own story, and it will clear Roland as sure as it will hang Silver." This, in every form and variety of language, was the oft repeated consolation that the old skipper was offering to his little niece, and not without effect. Elva and Wynnette were seated with the earl, who was talking to them in a low voice, and evidently trying to keep up their spirits. As soon as the squire entered the room his daughters all hurried to meet him, with anxious looks. "My dears," he said, "the doctors speak hopefully of your mother's condition. Let us be patient and trust in Providence. And for the present, my children, you must control your feelings, and keep away from her room." But this did not satisfy the daughters of Elfrida Force. They plied their father with questions. "What is the matter with mamma? Did the doctors tell you what ails her? When will she get well? How soon may we see her?" And so forth, and so forth. Mr. Force answered these questions as well as he was able, but not at all satisfactorily. The old skipper broke in upon their talk. "Force, I wish to the Lord you had ordered these girls down to breakfast. Here it is 10 o'clock, and not one of us has had a mouthful." "My dears, is that true?" demanded their father. "Oh, we could not touch any food, so long as we felt so anxious about dear mamma," answered Odalite, for the whole party. "Come down at once. Le, give Odalite your arm. Grandiere, take care of Rosemary. Enderby, look after Wynnette. Come, my little Elva, under my own wing," said the squire. And so the party of 8 went down to the public breakfast room; but in truth no one but the earl, the old skipper and the young lieutenant made any pretense of eating. The husband and daughters of Elfrida Force could not feed while the life of the wife and mother was in jeopardy; but they drank some strong coffee, which served to support their strength. After breakfast the young girls returned to the drawing room under the escort of the earl and the old captain; but Le remained by the side of Abel Force, who walked toward the office of the hotel. "The occupant of the little room adjoining our own has left this morning, and I wish to engage the apartment before any one else takes it. For, Le, if the doctors will not allow me to remain in the same apartment with my suffering wife, I must, at least, be in the next one, if possible," said Mr. Force, as he went up to the counter. The room was secured, and the two men turned to go upstairs together. "Uncle," said Le, "Odalite will not give me any answer. Will not fix a day for our marriage until her mother recovers." "Odalite is right, Le. How can she think of marriage, or of anything but her mother, at this crisis?" solemnly inquired Abel Force. "Oh, uncle, we have been so often disappointed, so often put off. It does seem as if fate were against us." "Don't be selfish, Le. Think, my dear boy, what anxiety we are all suffering just now." "I know it, uncle. I know it, and I share it. But how could our marriage affect the present circumstances? It could not increase the danger of my aunt, nor could it heighten our anxiety," pleaded the youth. "My dear Le, your passion blinds you to the fact that your marriage at this time would be deeply indecorous. Say no more about it, dear lad, until our beloved sufferer is out of danger." Le sighed profoundly, but did not answer. "Le," said the squire, in a low voice, to change the subject, "have you told old Grandiere why it is that Roland will not give evidence against the pirate captain, even to save himself?" "Yes, I have told him that Roland has been persuaded by Silver that he, Silver, is his, Roland's father. He said that he did not believe one word of it. He said that when the villain was down in Maryland he must have heard the story of the young man having been saved in his infancy from the wreck of the Carrier Pigeon, without a mark on person or clothing to point to his parentage, and taken advantage of the circumstance to claim Roland as his son, and get him in his power." "I think Grandiere was right," said Abel Force. When they re entered the parlor they found all their party present, idle and silent, because, in fact, they could settle themselves to neither occupation nor conversation while their minds were so full of anxiety. Le went and sat down beside Odalite. Mr. Force lingered a few moments in the room to bid his troubled daughters to trust in Providence and hope for the best. Then, telling them he was going up to sit in the room he had engaged adjoining their mother's, and that he might be found there if wanted, he left the parlor and went upstairs. First he stopped at the door of the side room and tapped lightly. The nurse came to answer the summons. "How is she?" he whispered. The nurse came out and softly closed the door behind her before answering: "She is sleeping quietly, and must not be disturbed on any account." "Thank you. That will do. I am going to sit in the next room. If I should be wanted, come to me there." "Yes, sir," said the woman, returning noiselessly to the sick chamber, and closing the door behind her. As Mr. Force turned away, his eyes fell upon the form of Rosemary Hedge moving silently as a spirit along the corridor. He went to her and whispered: "What is it, my dear?" "Nothing. I am only going to our room to put on my hat. Uncle Grandiere is going to take me to see dear Roland," replied the girl. "Ah, that is right. God bless you, my dear," said the squire, as Rosemary passed on to the large double bedded room in the same corridor which was occupied by the four girls. CHAPTER XX WHEN LOVERS MEET IN ADVERSE HOUR Rosemary quickly put on the olive green linsey suit in which she had crossed the sea, and the little round traveling cap in which she had ridden to the city, and hurried downstairs to join her uncle. Her dress was not too warm for these late April days. "Come, my little love," said the old skipper. "I could not find a carriage for you on the stand, nor even at the livery stable around the corner, so there is nothing for us but to pack ourselves into a moving black hole they call a street car, or to walk. I think by walking fast we could reach Capitol Hill sooner than by riding in one of these cars." "Let us walk, by all means," promptly replied Rosemary. They went downstairs together, and set out for a brisk rate down Pennsylvania Avenue. It was a fine morning, with a bright sun, and a deep blue sky mottled lightly with feathery white clouds, as became an April day. "You must keep up your heart, little girl," said the old man, as they walked on. "I do try to do so. I have trust in the Lord, and under Him, in you, Uncle Gideon. But oh, when I think of how the news affected her, my heart almost dies in my breast," sighed the girl. "Mrs. Force, do you mean?" "Yes, of course." "But why?" "Oh, don't you see? If the news of Roland's danger affected her so greatly, his state must be very serious." "My dear, Roland may have had nothing to do with the lady's attack. It looks to me as if it was an apoplectic fit, such as might have happened to any middle aged man or woman without any outside cause. Besides, I never heard of Mrs. Force taking the least interest in the young man, or even the slightest notice of him beyond mere civility." "Yes, she did. I'm sure she did. I always thought but indeed I hardly know why I thought so that she was kinder to me on account of Roland. She always sympathized with me. And it was the news of Roland's peril that brought on her illness. I know it was." "How do you know it, my dear?" "Because I was watching her while Wynnette was reading the paper. I was almost ready to die with my trouble, and I was looking to her for help and comfort, because she always sympathized with me. And I saw her start, and her eyes grow wide and scared, and her face turn white. And then I saw her rise to leave the room. And then, but not till then, the others saw her and went to her, but she sent them all back. And I knew it was about Roland, and I thought there was no hope for him, and I fell to screaming. Oh, uncle, it was so very bad in me to go on screaming so, but I couldn't help it. I couldn't faint and forget all about it, like Amanda Fitzallen used to do when she couldn't stand things any longer. So I had to keep screaming. If I hadn't, I do think my heart would have bursted." "It was all quite enough to frighten you into hysterics, my poor little girl, when I was not on hand to reassure you. But still, my dear, in future you must control yourself. There is nothing more contemptible in this world than a man or woman who cannot control himself or herself." "But, uncle, my heart would have bursted if I hadn't screamed." "Then, my dear, you should have let it burst rather than have screamed. This may seem harsh to you, my dear, but it is the best kindness. Self control, my little girl, is one of the mightiest powers in this world. It is the soul of the ruler, my dear," said the old skipper. And having taken this text he preached on it until they reached the foot of the Capitol Hill, and he lost his wind in climbing up it. In a short time they reached the Old Capitol prison. Capt. Grandiere had procured 2 passes, and armed with these presented himself and his niece at the guarded door, and was permitted to enter. "I know the way now, but let me take a long breath before I begin to climb all these stairs that are before us," said the old man, as he dropped upon a rude bench in the hall and began to wipe his face. Rosemary sat down beside him, and peeped charily through her green veil at the sentries that stood before the closed doors on each side of the hall. Presently the captain arose and told Rosemary to come along, and began to ascend the stairs. They went up 3 flights, and found themselves on the 3rd floor of the building in a wide passage, with closed doors guarded by sentries on each side. Walking between these, they reached the front end of the hall, where a small apartment had been made across it by a partition of wood. Before a rude door a sentry stood. Capt. Grandiere showed his permits, and the soldier opened the door to let them pass. They entered the small room, which, however, had the advantage of a large window and of perfect cleanliness — of almost aggressive cleanliness, for everything smelt of fresh water and fresh whitewash. Roland Bayard sat on the side of his narrow cot, engaged in reading the morning paper. As his visitors entered the place he looked up and gave a cry of mingled pleasure and reproach. "Uncle! Rosemary! Oh, Rosemary! Oh, uncle, how could you? Why did you?" "Roland, dear Roland, I couldn't help it. I wanted to see you so much. Oh, Roland, you are glad to see me, are you not?" pleaded Rosemary, going to him and putting both her hands on his shoulders, with all the innocent candor of her childhood. "Glad to see you? Glad?" echoed the young man, in a broken voice, as he took her tiny hands and pressed them to his heart and to his lips, while his hot tears fell upon them. Rosemary burst into a storm of tears and wept upon his shoulder. "Oh, uncle!" reproachfully exclaimed Roland, "why did you bring this child here?" "Because no power on earth would have kept her away. If I had not brought her she would have done some deadly thing. She would have gone and got a pass for herself. She would have come here alone, and exposed herself to insult on the way. You don't know what desperate daredevils these little blue eyed angels of our race can be, where their friends are in danger or in trouble," said the old man. "And oh, it is not only that I wanted to see you," said Rosemary, raising her tearful face from his shoulder, "but I wanted to beg you for my sake, Roland, to be just for yourself, to have mercy on yourself. You know, as we know, that you are not a pirate or a slave stealer. You know, as we know, that you were taken prisoner by the pirates when the Kitty was captured. Capt. Grandiere can testify to that, but he cannot swear that you never joined the pirate crew after you became their prisoner. He cannot swear that you never became the pirate captain's mate, as they charge you with being. Only you can tell what you did after recovering from your wounds on board the pirate ship. We know that you remained true to yourself and to your friends and to every principle of manhood and honesty, and we could swear that you did, from our lifelong knowledge of you. But oh, Roland! Such testimony would not be worth anything in a court of law, where moral conviction is not legal evidence. Oh, dear, dear Roland, take pity on yourself and on us, and testify to the facts that will vindicate you." These were her words, but no pen can give the pleading, prayerful, pathetic tones and looks and gestures with which they were uttered. The whole strong frame of the young man shook with the emotion that convulsed his soul. "Rosemary," he said at length, in a broken voice, "I am about to speak the words that must separate us forever." He paused, and she took up his cue. "That you cannot do, Roland. Neither man nor angel can utter words which would separate us forever. In this world we may be parted, Roland, if such be your will, but not forever — not forever," she said, in her tender, vibrating tones. "Rosemary, hear me! I cannot give the testimony that would vindicate myself, because the same testimony would convict Capt. Silver." "He will be convicted fast enough without your testimony," put in the old skipper. "Then it would help to convict him, so I must not give it." "But oh, Roland, why should you care for that wicked man — that wickedest man in the whole world?" pleaded Rosemary. "Because, poor child — and now come the words that must part us — because I am his son." Rosemary stared in blank amazement, while she grew pale as ashes. "You are no more his son than you are my son, and not half so much as you are Abel Force's son. Deuce take you, lad! Are you such a baby as to be beguiled by that man's lies? He found out your early history, and has made use of the facts, as well as the want of facts, to deceive you and claim you as his son, to get you in his power, to make you his comrade if he could, and to tie your tongue in any case. Ah, you must be a blind bat indeed not to see through him. Ah, Capt. Grandiere, old friend, you do not know. You do not know! Capt. Silver has proved the truth of his story to me," replied Roland, in a tone of despair. "How has he proved this?" demanded the old skipper. "I dare not tell you that. His story involves the honor of another family. I cannot breathe another word on the subject beyond the bare fact that I know myself to be Silver's son, and will not give testimony to convict my father. So much was due to you, and told that you may know why I will not testify. Then The old skipper let off a volley of oaths that might have been highly effectual in a storm at sea, or a fight with pirates, but that fell upon Rosemary's delicate ears like claps of thunder, and made her put up her hands to shelter them. And he finished by saying: "If I don't give a hint to the authorities, and have you put upon the stand and compelled to give evidence." The young man made no reply, but turning to Rosemary, began to ask about their mutual friends. The girl answered all his questions to the best of her knowledge. This conversation lasted until the old skipper arose to take leave. "Captain," said Roland, "my advice to you is to take Rosemary down to Maryland and leave her there with her friends. Washington, under present circumstances, is certainly no place for the child." "I will not go, Roland. I will not stir from this city until I see you through this trouble," said the girl. "You hear that?" inquired the skipper. "And you see that I could not get her away without turning Turk and tyrant, and calling in the power of the law, and using force and violence to back up that? What can an old ruffian like me, even though I weigh 200 pounds, and am the terror of the roughest crew afloat, do with the might of a blue eyed angel? She'll do as she likes, if she dies for it," growled the skipper. "You will let me come to see you every day, Roland, and in that way I can try to bear this," pleaded Rosemary. "May the Lord bless you, my child. May the Lord bless you and keep you safe always," breathed Roland, as he folded her to his heart and kissed her, even as he had been accustomed to do when he was a little lad and she was a baby. And so the interview ended. End of chapter 20. Chapters 21 and 22 of When Shadows Die, by E.D.E.N. Southworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Chapter 21. Country Visitors. Captain Grandiere and Rosemary left the Old Capitol prison by the way they had entered it, and bent their steps toward Pennsylvania Avenue, and thence toward their hotel. The old skipper went upstairs with Rosemary to ask after Mrs. Force. They found all the young people of their party still in the drawing room. Mr. Force was up another flight of stairs, in the room next to that of his sick wife. Lieutenant Force had returned to his ship. Odalite, Wynnette and Elva were seated about the room, trying to work at their flower embroidery and conversing at intervals in hushed voices. "Well, and how is the mother by this time?" cheerily inquired the captain, with a view to encourage the daughters. "Dr. Bolton has just made a second visit, and says that she will do well if not disturbed," replied Odalite. "Thank Heaven! I hope she will be all right in a day or two!" exclaimed Grandiere, heartily, as he threw himself into a big armchair and dropped his hat between his feet. "How did you leave Roland?" inquired Wynnette. "Perfectly well, as to his bodily health. He inquired after you all, and sent his respects to you." "How does he take his arrest and imprisonment? That is what I meant," said Wynnette. "Bravely and patiently, as should a man with a good conscience," replied the captain. "You can prove that he was a prisoner among the pirates, and not a comrade of their crew?" said Wynnette. "I can swear that he was their prisoner," replied the old man. "And, of course, that will clear him," said Wynnette, conclusively. The old skipper did not contradict her. Perhaps he might have done so, however, if at that moment the door had not opened to admit a waiter, who brought a handful of cards that he held together like an open fan. Before he could deliver them, a group of laughing visitors passed him and entered the room. Rosemary made a dart at the group, exclaiming: "Mother! Oh, mother!" She was caught in the arms of Mrs. Dorothy Hedge and covered with tears and kisses, while the other three girls rushed upon Miss Susannah Grandiere, and the old skipper trotted across the room and shook hands with his grandnephew Sam, who was the only member of the visiting party left for him. The words that followed on all sides were at first rather incoherent, as such greetings after such partings are apt to be. "We followed up the fellow who brought up our tickets. Fancy our staying downstairs to wait for him to go and come! So, as he insisted on taking our tickets first, and handed us blank ones and a pencil, I wrote all our names down and let him take them, but we followed close behind the tickets," said Mr. Sam Grandiere. "Cards, dear Sam, cards," whispered Wynnette. "How is it that you are not in the army?" inquired Capt. Grandiere. "Because somebody had to stay home, to plow and sow and look after the family," replied the young man. "And so you never volunteered, and you bought a substitute when you were drafted?" "I never volunteered because my father and brother were both in the army, and because, as I said before, somebody had to stay home and look after the crops. And I never was drafted. If I had been, I should have gone in, because I could not have found it in my conscience to tempt any poor fellow with money to go and get shot in my place. No, if I had been drafted, I should have gone." "Right, my boy! Right, right, right!" exclaimed his uncle, heartily. "And how are all here?" inquired Miss Susannah Grandiere, when at length all were seated. "You see us all here, except papa and mamma. Papa is well, but mamma—" Here the speaker, Odalite, paused, as the tears choked her voice. Miss Grandiere looked from one to the other of the family party in mute, though anxious inquiry. "Mrs. Force was taken suddenly ill this morning," said the old captain, speaking for his friends. "No, now don't be alarmed. The doctor, who has just left her, says that she is doing well, and will be all right if kept quiet," he added, to soothe the uneasiness of the visitors. "But what is the matter with her?" inquired Mrs. Hedge. "She had a severe shock, and fell into a swoon. She has been lying prostrate, but quiet, ever since. Now, don't be alarmed. There is no danger." "But what sort of a shock?" inquired Miss Grandiere. "Susannah, you were always inquisitor general. Mrs. Force heard suddenly that a friend of ours, young Roland Bayard, had been taken prisoner under exceptional circumstances." "What circumstances?" persisted the inquisitor. The old skipper heaved a deep sigh, and, as briefly as he could, told the story of Roland's double capture, first by the Argente that took the Kitty, and afterward by the Eagle that took the Argente. And he added, without reserve, the circumstances of Capt. Silver's alleged claim upon Roland, which sealed the lips of the latter. "Roland, the pirate's son? Why, he is no more Silver's son than he is mine!" exclaimed young Sam. "But now tell us how it was that you found us so soon." "Well," said Sam, "to begin at the beginning, on Monday morning we got your telegram saying that you had all arrived safe, and that Uncle Gideon was along with you, and you would be with us in a few days. Naturally, we were all rejoiced, and we waited for you. But on Wednesday morning we got the New York papers, telling all about the capture of the Argente by the Eagle, and the arrival of the Argente under command of Lieut. Force, and of the prize being ordered to the navy yard here." "And it did not need one to rise from the dead to reveal the fact that we should all come directly to this city to meet Le," put in Wynnette. "No, it didn't," assented Sam. "And so I offered to come up and see you, and Aunt Dolly and Aunt Sukey said they would come, too. So I harnessed the two strongest draft horses to the old carryall, and we set out yesterday morning. We got as far as Horsehead last night, and put up there for the night. This morning we started early, and reached the city about noon. First, like a fool, I drove my party to your Sometime House at the West End. Found it was all turned into public offices. Then we went the rounds of the hotels, and now at last we have found you." "Good boy!" exclaimed Wynnette. "But have you found rooms?" anxiously inquired the skipper. "No. Our carryall is at the door. We came here to call first, but we also hoped that we would be able to put up here," said Sam. "Indeed, I hope you may," said the old skipper. "But the dearest thing in Washington at the present time is space. If I had a room to myself I would offer it to these ladies, but I have only a single bed in a double bedded room." "But, at any rate, you will order your carriage around to the livery stable and spend the day with us. That will give Mr. Grandiere time to see about your rooms, here or elsewhere," said Odalite to the two elder ladies, who were seated on the sofa, with Rosemary between them, with each of her little hands clasped one in each of theirs. "Yes, my dear, thank you. We will spend the day," announced Mrs. Hedge, for her party. "Come up now and lay off your wraps," said Rosemary, leading the way to what, in party parlance, was now called the room. "Uncle," inquired Sam Grandiere, very anxiously, "are matters really serious with Roland Bayard?" "So serious, my lad, that I fear for the worst. Unless he can be disabused of this idea that Silver has impressed upon him, that he is the pirate's own son, he will never be induced to give the testimony that will convict that pirate and vindicate himself." "If Miss Sibby Bayard were only here, she might be of use at this time," mused Sam, aloud. "Miss Sibby Bayard is here, you bet! Talk of the devil and you know what follows," said a voice on the threshold, and the form of the lady in question appeared at the door. "When a thing is got to be done, sez I, the sooner the better, sez I. And so here I am, good folks." CHAPTER XXII NEW HOPE "Miss Sibby!" exclaimed the assembled party, in one breath, as they all arose to welcome her. "Oh, yes," said the good woman, after she had shaken hands all around, and had sunk breathless into the nearest easy chair. "It is all mighty fine to cry out 'Miss Sibby,' as if you were overjoled at the sight of me, but deeds speak louder than words, sez I. and them as runs away to the city and leave me behind, sez I, and then pretends to be glad to see me, sez I, is nothing but sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal, sez I. Yes, it's you I mean, Sam Grandiere." "But, Miss Sibby, I didn't run away and leave you, ma'am," pleaded the young fellow. "And plenty of room in the carryall, too, as might have incommodated me very well. The old saying says as 'where there is a will there is a way,' and I says, correspondamentally, sez I, 'where there is a way, sez I, there out to be a will,' sez I. Yes, I'm talking to you, Sam Grandiere. You had the way to take me, but you hadn't got the will." "Indeed, Miss Sibby, I didn't know you wanted to come. I should have been glad enough to take you." "Why didn't you ask me, then? You might 'a' knowed, soon as the news reached our neighborhood as all the folks had come back from furrin parts, and Gideon Grandiere among 'em, as I would want to come up and hear news of my lad. But you run away and left me behind. And when I found it out, I just said to myself, sez I, I'll just harness up my old mule, sez I, and I won't be long behind 'em, sez I. And so here I am." "How did you find us out?" inquired Capt. Grandiere. "In the funniest way as ever you see. As I was a driving slowly up the Pennsylwany Avenue, who should I see but that dog Joshua, a walking as majestical down the street as if the whole city belonged to him. I knowed him at once, and naterally looked to see who was along of him. And then who should I see but that nigger a walking down the street behind the dog, as if the whole country belonged to him, if you please. So I stopped the mule and hollered to him. And the worst of hollering after anybody on Pennsylwany Avenue, as that everybody in hearing thinks as you're hollering after them. So everybody had to turn and look at me and my mule, and the nigger stood and stared, and I had to holler after him again to ax him where his master was a putting up, and he come to the side of the cart and told me, and axed me to let him get in and drive me to the hotel, 'cause, he said, every one was a staring at me." "And so Dickson drove you here, did he, ma'am?" inquired the old skipper. "He did. But as for the people staring at me, sez I to that nigger, 'If I am a show, I'm a free show,' sez I, 'and it will cost 'em nothing,' sez I, 'and it ain't often as the poor white trash in the city gets a good chance to stare at the descendant of the great duke,' sez I, 'and you may lay your life on that,' sez I. So that nigger got in and drove the mule, and Joshua marched behind as solemn as a funeral procession. And so we got here. And now how is my boy, my adopted neffy, and where is he?" "Roland is in good health. He is at present living on Capitol Hill," answered the old salt, who was unwilling at this juncture to enter into explanations with Miss Sibby as to Roland's real state. "And why isn't the boy staying here with you all?" inquired the old lady. "Oh, there is no room here. We are fearfully crowded. The 4 young ladies have to sleep 2 in a bed, in a double bedded room." "That's ruinous to health. Why don't you all go to some other hotel?" "Because they are all more crowded than this." "Then what am I to do?" "Oh, Sam and I are going out to hunt for lodgings now. We have to find lodgings for my 2 nieces and nephew. We will hunt up a place for you also. Of course you will stay here to day." "It is perfectly dreadful! If I had 'a' knowed all this, I'd never have left home. I had room enough to turn round in there, anyways. When people's well off, sez I, they ought to be content, sez I. But how is Abel Force and his wife and Odalite? I don't see any of 'em around." "Mrs. Force is not well, and Mr. Force is with her, I believe." "Odalite went to show my 2 nieces to a room to take off their things," discreetly answered the old sailor. "What's the matter along of Elfrida Force?" "Well, I really don't know. Not much, I hope." "I know. It's trotting around so much. That's where it is. When people gets to be past their prime, sez I, they ought to take care of what's left of them, sez I. 'Dancing bears,' sez I, 'must pay for their airs,' sez I." "What sort of a time have you had since the war began, Miss Sibby?" inquired the old salt, with a view to take the visitor off dangerous ground. But he fell from the frying pan into the fire. The old lady's face flushed, and her eyes snapped. "Don't ask me what sort of a time I've had. Old Scratch's own time. What with being raided by first one party and then another, I have hardly a sheep or a pig or a duck or a hen left on the place. And what with being called a rebel by the Unioners and a traitor by the Confederers, I have hardly a morsel of self-respect or Christian charity left in my heart. And I haven't a bit of respect for either party, not I, clapper-clawing each other like a pack o' wild cats for nothing in this world, as I can see, 'less it is because they haven't got no furriners to clapper-claw. If free people can't live peaceable in a free, healthy, plentiful country, sez I, the sooner they get the Turkey of Constantinople to rule over them, the better, sez I." "You seem to be excited, Miss Sibby." So would you be excited if you had suffered all that I have. First comes the Unioners and carries off all my pigs, and calls me a rebel because I object. And then comes the Confederers and carries off all my fowls, and calls me a traitor because I don't see the right of it. Unioners and Confederers! I call 'em bluebottle flies and gray back bugs, I do." "Oh, Miss Sibby!" "Well, then, I do! I hain't no patience with neither party! A cutting and a slashing at each other like Injuns! Only last week a lot of bluebottles come riding up and searched the house after a spy, as if I would harbor a spy! And after eating up and drinking up everything in the house, and putting me in fear of my life, they mounted and rode away, telling me to 'take care of myself.' Take care of myself, indeed, after scaring me almost to death!" "Oh, Miss Sibby, I am afraid you are not—" Whatever he was going to say was cut short by the sudden opening of the door, and the reentrance of Odalite Force, escorting Mrs. Hedge and Miss Grandiere. "You here, Miss Sibby!" exclaimed the three ladies, in a breath. "What the Bluebottles and the Graybacks has left of me is here, as you see," replied Miss Bayard, rising to receive the welcome of the new arrivals. "And now, Sam, my boy, we will go out hunting lodgings, and if we can't find them in the city, we will even go a little way into the country," said the old skipper, as he arose and bowed himself out of the room, followed by his nephew. When they had gone, Lord Enderby, who had been left out of the talk, now fancied himself out of place, so he likewise arose and bowed himself out. When the half dozen women were left in the parlor, they drew their chairs together and fell into a confidential talk. Miss Sibby inquired more particularly into the nature of Mrs. Force's illness, and Wynnette, with her brusque frankness, told the truth, that the shock of hearing Roland Bayard's arrest and imprisonment, under the charge of piracy, had made the lady ill. Miss Sibby just stared with incredulous amazement. "Roland Bayard! My Roland, charged with piracy! Why, it is all a funny mistake, you know, that must be soon set right. And that old gay deceiver, Gideon Grandiere, to go and tell me that he was boarding on Capitol Hill, when he was in prison there! What did he do it for? Was he afeard of scaring me about my own Roland? Why, Lor', sez I, when I know my boy is innocent, sez I know his innocence is gwine to shine forth like the sun at midday, sez I, and make his accusers ashamed, sez I." Here it was felt to be right Miss Sibby should be told of the real state of the case, and so she had to hear all about the taking of the Kitty by the Argente, when the skipper and his mate were made prisoners by the pirate, who set the former at liberty on the coast of Cornwall, and kept the latter a captive on board the Argente; and then of the capture of the Argente by the Eagle, and the bringing of the prize into port with the pirate captain and his first officer on board; and finally the identification of the two prisoners as Angus Anglesea, alias Captain Silver, and Roland Bayard, alias Craven Cloud; and the alleged paternal claim of the former upon the latter, which now closed the lips of the claimed son from saving himself by testifying against the self styled father. Miss Sibby's eyes opened, her brows raised, and her chin dropped in sheer, horrified amazement. "Why, them's all lies!" she indignantly exclaimed. "Abel Force knows they're lies. Why don't he go and tell the boy better? As to that Anglesea a turning out to be no Anglesea at all, no English gentleman at all, and no military officer at all, but just a pirate, after being a thief and a forger, I'm not a bit surprised at that. No more would I be surprised if he was found out to be Old Scratch himself, allowed to come on earth in the human form in these very bad times. But as for anything going amiss with my boy on account of his being stuffed with lies about that pirate being of his own father, it shan't be done. Me and Abel Force will put a stop to that. Abel Force knows who that boy's father is, and I have my suspicions. There shan't be a hair of his head hurt, mind that," said the old lady, shaking her head. "Oh, Miss Sibby!" pleaded little Rosemary, clasping her hands prayerfully, and raising her large blue eyes to the speaker's face. "Will you save Roland?" "Abel Force can, and he will, or I'll know the reason why," replied Miss Bayard. For hours longer the conversation ran on Roland Bayard and the net of circumstances that had caught him in this perilous false position. They were still talking when the two gentlemen returned and reported that they had found comfortable lodgings for the travelers, who might take possession of their new quarters that evening. "Where is Abel Force?" inquired the captain, as they all went down to luncheon. "Papa sent word down that he did not need luncheon, but would join us at dinner in the evening," replied Odalite. And they began the meal. And meanwhile, where was Abel Force? CHAPTER 23 and 24 of When Shadows Die, by E.D.E.N. Southworth. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Chapter 23. Too Great a Burden. Abel Force went into the little room he had engaged, adjoining the sick chamber of his wife. It was no more than a closet, and had evidently been used as a dressing room attached to the large chamber, before the exigencies of war had rendered space in the house too valuable for the little place to be used for any purpose but a bedroom. It was furnished very simply, with an iron bedstead, a washstand with a glass above it, a single chair, and half a dozen wooden pegs on the door to hang clothes. Mr. Force turned the back of the only chair to the window that was opposite the door and overlooked the yard, and he sat down and drew the packet he had taken from his wife's room, and again looked at the superscription. Yes, it was directed in a firm hand to "Abel Force, Esquire." It was tied up with cord and sealed with wax. But under the cord a little note had been slipped, and this also was addressed, but in a weak and tremulous hand, to "Abel Force, Esquire." He opened the note to read it. It was without date, yet he felt sure that it must have been written on that very morning, before the sudden fall of the woman had prevented her flight. The note ran as follows: "The hour has come when I must drop the mask of deceit and show myself in my true colors — a living lie, a hypocrite, though never, never happy in falsehood and hypocrisy. Your love and trust have wounded and tortured me. The reverence of children has humiliated me. No, never for a moment happy or at ease in my disguise. It is almost a relief now to throw it off and reveal myself as I am, even though the revelation must banish me from your presence and my children's forever in this world, and perhaps in the next. Yet, I repeat, it is a relief to throw off the disguise which has suffocated me like a heavy cloak these many years, and has been more than that — has been like Medea's robe of fire for the last few years since Anglesea's first visit to us. The enclosed packet contains a manuscript that was written at intervals during this time, and with a view to the chance of just such a crisis as has now come. I leave it for you to read. I do not ask you to pardon me, for I know there is no such thing as pardon for me in this world. I do not even ask you to judge charitably of me. Charity is for the sinner, not for the hypocrite. I only ask you to read the story, that you may understand the fiendish hold one human being had upon my body, soul and spirit, my very life here and hereafter. And after having read it, I, who have no right to ask you anything, dare still to ask you this — to ask, to plead, to pray that you will be kind to one who is the guiltless victim of others' guilt, and to save him if you can. And now, farewell! And oh, my whole heart goes out in this cry. Oh, God! Oh, God! Though I cannot be pardoned, yet oh, hear my prayer, and save and bless my husband and my children." That was all. Abel Force dropped his head upon his breast, and remained in deep thought for a few moments. Then, with a heavy sigh, he aroused himself, drew a match case from his pocket, lighted a match, set fire to the little note, and held it down upon the stone window sill with the point of his penknife until it was consumed to ashes. Then he went to lock his door, to prevent intrusion, but he found that he had already taken that precaution. Finally he returned to his chair, cut the cords of the packet, broke the seal, and read as follows: "The Story of a Withered Heart. "You have often heard how lonely, loveless and neglected was my childhood and youth. You are reminded of these facts now, not in excuse of what followed, but as the causes of the effects that destroyed my life. You know that I was born at Enderby Castle, where the first years of my infancy passed. When I was scarcely 4 years of age, I lost my mother, too young to understand or to lament my loss. The pageantry of her funeral is one of the strongest impressions among the brain pictures of that time. A few days after that event my father left Enderby, taking me with him. We went to Weirdwaste, an estate he had acquired through his marriage with my mother, situated on the west coast of Ireland. It was, if possible, even more drear, lonely and desolate than Enderby Cliff itself. This place, in which I was destined to pass my childhood, was built of gray stone, 2 stories high, around the 4 sides of a hollow quadrangle, at the inland end of a long, flat point of land stretching far out into the Atlantic Ocean, which at high tide swept over it, covering more than 2/3 of the ground, and the moan of the sea never ceased from the sorrowful shore. North, west, and south around the point of land, nothing but sky and water was to be seen. East, inland, was a wild waste, dotted here and there by the huts of the poorest peasantry on the island, and that means also the poorest people on the earth. The old manor house was shockingly out of repair, but because it was the best building on the estate, it was occupied by my father's land steward, O'Nally, and his wife. These two had been old servants of my mother's family, and had been very much devoted to her. After my father's arrival with me at the house, they also acted in the capacity of butler and housekeeper. My father had brought with him a valet and a groom, and for me a nurse and a governess. I was very warmly welcomed and fondly caressed by my mother's old servants, and so for the first few days I was very happy at Weirdwaste. We had no neighbors but the poor tenantry in the huts on the waste behind the manor house, and we saw no company but the vicar of the little Protestant parish in the village of Bantrim, 10 miles inland, and the county practitioner from the same place. These two old men remained strong, clear portraits in the gallery of my memory. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was a large, fair, clean-shaved, bald-headed old gentleman, with blue eyes and a beaming smile. He was very, very good to me, and I soon learned to love him. The medical practitioner, Dr. Alexander, was a tall, gaunt, high-nosed, red-faced man, with a shock of iron-gray hair and whiskers, a formidable frown, and a brusque manner. He also was very, very kind to me, but I never got over my fear of him. My father did not intend to remain at Weirdwaste, as I soon found out. He had the vicar and the doctor come and spend the day and dine at the house, so they might see the child who was to be left at Weirdwaste under their joint care. The doctor pronounced me a wonderfully sound and healthy child, who would grow finely in the pure, invigorating air of the seaside. The doctor promised to look after my health, and the vicar to superintend my education, and both engaged to write frequently and keep my father advised as to my welfare. So, having taken every precaution he thought necessary to my well-being, and having settled the urgent business that brought him to Ireland, my father bade me good-by, and left Weirdwaste to travel on the continent. And then began the loneliest life ever led by motherless child. O'Nally and his wife were an old couple. They kept 2 old servants, a woman who did the housework, and a man who did the outdoor work. And they kept an old horse and an old jaunting car. My nurse was a respectable, elderly matron. My governess, a discreet, middle-aged maiden, selected by my father especially for good qualities. Surely I had all the care and protection that was needed. But I had no love, no play, no amusement, no companions. Even the warm-hearted peasant women, who had come down from their huts on the waste to welcome their little lady of the manor, came no more after that first day. Not that they had ceased to care for me, but because the occasion of their coming had passed, and their hard work kept them all at home. On fine Sundays O'Nally took me in the jaunting car, with himself and his wife, to church, and we heard Mr. Clement preach, and after the service I sometimes got a pat on the head, and a smile and kind word from the vicar. He was a widower without children, so I never was asked to his house. Once a week the county practitioner rode out to the manor house to see after my health, that he might report to my father. Also, if no one from Weirdwaste happened to go to church on a Sunday, the vicar would ride out to the manor in the course of the week to inquire the cause of absence and report to my father. These occasional drives to church on Sundays, and semi-occasional visits from the vicar and the doctor, were the only variations in the monotony of my days, which were ordinarily passed in this way. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Nurse Barnes would wake me up, give me a bath, and dress me in such a plain black frock. I had not even the pleasure of pretty clothes. And then she would give me my breakfast, such a plain breakfast of oatmeal and milk. I had never the indulgence of cakes or sugar plums, which was all very well for me, no doubt, but which was also very dull. Then came Miss Murray with the school books, and I would sit alone with her in the schoolroom, trying to study my first reader, while she sat reading or sewing, but scarcely ever speaking. Then came the noon dinner of boiled mutton and potatoes, and after that more school for an hour or two. Then a walk on the sands, all around the point, if the tide was low, or if the tide were high and the cape covered with water, we took a walk on the waste behind the manor house. Sometimes I got a letter from my father, enclosed in one to the steward or to my governess. CHAPTER 24 A New Mother One day I received a terrible shock. Child as I was, I felt it severely. It came so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that it felt like a thunderbolt upon me. It was a morning in November when the carrier's cart stopped at the manor house and left a box directed to me, in the care of the steward. When it was opened, it revealed a beautiful cake wrapped in many folds of silver paper. I was delighted, for I had not tasted cake for months. But oh, I did not taste it even then. The letter that lay on the top of the cake poisoned it. That letter told me that my father had married and was spending his honeymoon in Paris. I had a stepmother, a being whom, I knew not how or why, unless perhaps from the idle talk of servants, I had learned to hate as an evil and to dread as an enemy, though it never occurred to me that my father would give me one. And yet he had married within 5 months after my mother's death. I could not touch the poisoned cake. I know not what became of it. I cried all that day and many days after. The steward and his wife and the 2 old servants who had known and loved and served my mother encouraged me with their sympathy and lamentations to yield to my grief and despair. But the governess frowned upon me and lectured me upon my duty to my parents, as it was her business to do, only it seemed to me cruel in her. As days passed, my passionate grief subsided. My father did not bring his bride to Weirdwaste, which was indeed no fit place to bring a fine lady, nor did he send for me to join them wherever they might be. He heard regularly from me through the doctor, the vicar, the steward, or my governess, and he seemed to be content with my condition. So the year passed away. I was thankful to my father for one thing, that he did not bring my stepmother and myself together. This was all wrong, but I did not know it then. I was unconsciously influenced by the sentiments of my own mother's own old servants who were about me, and who, whenever Miss Murray was out of sight, would commiserate with me on the subject of my stepmother, and then rejoice with me on the fact that no future heir to Enderby that might be born of the second marriage could deprive me of my inheritance to Weirdwaste, which was mine in right of my own mother. Ah me! Enderby Castle and Weirdwaste sounded well enough in the peerage, but in point of fact the united rent roll of both places did not reach over £1,000 per annum, and my father, for his rank, was a very poor man. I expected to see my father at Christmas. He wrote to the steward to say that he would come and bring Lady Enderby with him, and that the house must be made as comfortable as possible for her reception, and that the suite of rooms pointing south must be fitted up for her especial use. This letter filled my soul with dismay. I could have looked forward with delight to the visit of my father had he been coming alone, but I could only dread the meeting with my stepmother. However, both the pleasure and the pain were saved me, for after the servants had got the house ready for the reception of my father and his new wife, there came another letter saying that the delicate health of Lady Enderby obliged him to take her to Italy for the winter. And in place of my father's and stepmother's visit came a box of presents. I was again divided in my feelings, sorry not to see my father, glad not to see my stepmother. The Christmas box was a large and well-filled one, packed with flannels and blankets, and tea and sugar for the old woman in the huts on the waste, and containing another smaller box with cakes, sweetmeats, and sugar plums for me and my small household. I heard the steward remark to his wife that the new countess must be well off, or the earl must have come into money some way, for this was the very first Christmas that he had ever sent anything to the poor on the estate. As the guardian of his daughter, the heiress, he forgave many of them their rent, but he never helped them in any other way. And so at Christmas the old people on the waste were made happy. And now let me add here that as long as I remained at the old manor house, this Christmas dole came every year. After this I heard less of the cruelty of my father in afflicting me with a stepmother. I heard even less of the wickedness of stepmothers in general, and the probable enormity of my stepmother in particular. The old people from the waste came down in crowds to the manor house on Christmas Day to thank me for the dole that had been sent to them on Christmas Eve. This was the only pleasure we had. There was no merrymaking, and the state of the roads prevented us even from going to church. Oh, the dreary winter that followed! No one came to the house except the vicar and the doctor, who made weekly calls to report to my father, and we went nowhere at all. That was my first winter at Weirdwaste. And here let me add that all succeeding winters were like that. I had no companions, no amusements, no occupations except my schoolbooks and my piano. I had not even a pet bird or cat or dog. The steward and his wife were good to me, but they were engaged in their affairs. Miss Murray was faithful, but when she was not hearing my lessons, or guiding my fingers over the keys of the piano, she was busied in reading. I never knew anybody to read so much as she did. She had no other recreation. When the spring returned, we began to take walks on the sand again when the tide was out, and we drove to church on Sundays when the state of the roads permitted us. On the 1st of August we received news from my father. He was at Enderby Castle, to which he had taken my stepmother for a temporary sojourn. He wrote to the steward to tell him that an heir had been born to Enderby, and he wrote to me to say that my new mother had given me a dear little brother, and that he hoped I would love them both very much. I was not quite 4 years old when my own dear mother died. I was but a few weeks past 5 now when I was told that I had a little brother by my father's new wife, and that I must love both. I could not do it. You will see what a sensitive and badly trained child I was when I tell you that I fell into hysterical sobs and tears and refused to be comforted. It seemed to me that I had quite lost my father, that he had been taken away from me by the new woman and the new child. I remember crying aloud to my own mother in heaven to come and take me away, because no one cared for me on earth. Miss Murray coaxed, lectured, remonstrated, all in vain. I would not hear reason or receive consolation. The 2 O'Nallys and the 2 old servants sympathized with me, and petted me, and cried over me. They never said a word against my father or my stepmother, personally or in my presence. But I often overheard them saying it was a burning shame to neglect a child as I was neglected, that I ought to be with my father and stepmother wherever they were, etc., etc., and their words deepened in me the sense of injury I felt. And yet, in justice to my father and his wife, I must say that no wrong was intended to me. We were all the victims of circumstances, as you will judge as I go on. It was on this occasion that I wrote my first letter to my father, with much help from my governess. As soon as I had got over my paroxysms of grief, which did not happen for days, Miss Murray insisted that I should answer my father's letter and wish him joy of his heir, and send my love to my new mother and little brother. This I most positively refused to do, declaring with a new burst of tears that I did not wish him any joy in his son, that I did not love my new brother, and that I had no new mother. I had but one mother who was in heaven, and I should never have another. My governess insisted, and tried to intimidate me into compliance. Whereupon I told her that she should not wish to make me write falsehoods, and that for my part I was quite ready to be burned at the stake, like Bishop Bonner, for the truth's sake, rather than write what I did not feel and what was not true. You see from this what a morbid, sensitive, extravagant little soul I was even at that tender age, and what exaggerated views I took of every trial. My governess had to yield the point. How could she even wish her pupil to write falsely? We compromised the matter by my consenting to write a short note to my father, telling him that I was glad to hear that he was well, and asking him when he would come to see me. A week later I got a most affectionate letter from my father, saying that he would visit his dear little daughter as soon as he thought it would be safe to leave his wife, who had lain in a low condition ever since the arrival of her babe. But my father did not come. It was, in fact, October before the countess was able to leave her room. Then the physicians ordered her to the south of France, whither my father soon took her, with her infant son. Another dreary winter followed me at Weirdwaste. The same confinement to the house, without companions, or amusements, or occupations, except my elderly attendants and my schoolbooks and music. No visitors except the vicar and the doctor. No visits except church, on exceptional Sundays when the roads were passable. I grew into a very strange child, precocious in a certain sort of intelligence gained from books, but backward in all knowledge of child life, and depressed in spirits. I received occasional letters from my father, and wrote others, touched up by my governess. End of chapter 24.